Hello, welcome to this short video about the functional anatomy of the cerebellum from the Swansea University Medical School. My name is Professor Phil Newton. This video is intended primarily for first and second year medical students at the Swansea University Medical School and physicians associate students as well, but it should be of interest to anyone who wants to understand the basic functional anatomy of the cerebellum. And after I finish telling you about it, I hope that's going to be everyone, because the cerebellum is an amazing piece of kit. What I hope you're able to do then by the end of this video is to be able to identify the main components of the cerebellum and its connection to the brainstem, spinal cord and cerebral hemispheres. We're just going to work through the basics of where the cerebellum is, what it does and what happens when it goes wrong. First thing to do then is say whereabouts is the cerebellum. I've labelled it here. You can see it's at the posterior part of the brain, hanging off the back in the posterior fossa. Occupies a significant volume within the brain, and it's very recognizable on most sections, most anatomical models, most radiological images. Here's another view of the ventral surface of the brain, and you can see that the cerebellum is split into two cerebellar hemispheres, occupying again, as you can see, a significant volume at the back of the brain. This is a three-dimensional image. I'll let it play through. Again, this shows you whereabouts the cerebellum is in the skull relative to other regions of the brain. What does the cerebellum do? Understanding what the cerebellum does will really help me explain to you the anatomy of the cerebellum and what happens when it goes wrong. The simplest way of summarizing what the cerebellum does, or what the cerebellum is best known for, is a coordination of movement. And that's distinct from initiating movements and selecting which movements to undertake. When movements are ongoing, when they're happening, when they've been selected and initiated, the cerebellum tries to make them as smooth as possible and tries to make sure they are as close as possible to what we have intended to do in terms of voluntary movement. The cerebellum is also important for motor learning, particularly when we're learning motor tasks. Obviously, the better we get at motor tasks, the more the role of the cerebellum is. And there is some evidence that the cerebellum has roles in cognition. We don't understand those very well. I'll try and talk a bit about them at the end. A really important key takeaway message from this video is also that the wiring of the cerebellum is ipsilateral. Of course, that means that a damage to the cerebellum, or the pathways that feed the cerebellum, is normally expressed ipsilaterally. There are some complications to that, as we'll see. It's not as straightforward as being fully ipsilateral, but basically from a functional and a pathological, from a clinical perspective, the cerebellum is wired ipsilaterally. Alright, this is my simplified version, or as simple as version as I could make it, of what it is that the cerebellum does. When we're trying to enact a movement, particularly a voluntary movement, but any complicated movement, the cerebral motor cortex decides what should happen. The primary motor cortex programs the motor commands. It sends those down the spinal cord to the relevant muscles, where the muscles then attempt to do whatever it is that the motor cortex wanted them to do. There's a two-way exchange of information throughout that process. Sensory information from the muscles about how stretched they are, whereabouts they are in space, etc. goes back up to the motor cortex. For many of us, unfortunately, what we want to do, what we intend to do, and what actually happens isn't always the same. The cerebellum has a key role in monitoring this exchange of information and correcting where what is supposed to happen isn't quite the same as what has actually happened. It does a lot of fine-tuning of voluntary motor movements. It also makes predictions that then inform planned future movements. Let's say we're walking along, or we're talking as I am now. The cerebellum will be monitoring the commands that go to our legs and also to our jaws and our tongue and our larynx and so on, that make the movements happen. It also predicts on behalf of and with coordination with the motor cortex to say this is what we will do next, and allows the motor cortex to prepare for the programming of those voluntary and coordinated movements. This is a simple summary of the anatomy then of what's called the little brain. Cerebellum literally means little brain, and it has a structure that is very much like a separate independent brain hanging off the back of the main cerebrum. You can see here, if I turn this into a pointer, on the top here, we've got looking at the posterior view of the cerebellum, looking at the major structural features, and these are schematic representations of those major features. It's the different lobes of the cerebellum, the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe, separated by fissures. You've also then got an arrangement of the cerebellum into hemispheres. This isn't immediately obvious when we're looking at the anatomy of the cerebellum, but it is functionally important. The reason for that then is that the anatomical arrangement of the cerebellum is into lobes, but the functional arrangement of the cerebellum is into hemispheres. And you can see this here. You've got the lateral, medial hemispheres. You've got left and right versions of those. Then you've got the structure in the center, which is the vermis, or the midline of the cerebellum. Each of these, as I've said, is further subdivided. We don't need to go into the great detail of those right now. And some key facts, or things that are often told to us about the cerebellum: it only constitutes 10% of the total mass of the brain, but it has more neurons in it than all of the other regions of the brain put together. There are different estimates for exactly what the ratio is of neurons in the cerebellum to the cerebrum, but the cerebellum definitely has a lot of neurons. The means by which it does that is that a lot of the neurons are very small, and I'll talk you through towards the end what some of the major neuronal cell types are in the cerebellum. Let's have a closer look then at where these three cerebellar lobes are. I'll just pause while you watch this through. And you can see here there are three colors on this three-dimensional representation. Two of them, though, are fairly well hidden. So if we separate out the three lobes, first we look at the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, and now you can see it in more detail where it's highlighted here in red. And then in this next slide, the posterior lobe of the cerebellum is highlighted in red. And you can see that from an external view, the posterior lobe constitutes the majority of the cerebellum. Now then, the floccular nodular lobe is highlighted in red, and you can see that it only appears to be two little bits sticking outside of the posterior lobe. And that's the reason for that is because the cerebellum is actually a folded structure. If I go on to the next slide, that'll hopefully explain it in a bit more detail. Here on the left here we have a cartoon representing the normal cerebellum, and this on the right here is what we might consider to be an unfolded cerebellum. If we think about this being actually the native cerebellum, the way that it is arranged on the back of the brainstem is it's folded up underneath itself. This structure here in blue is the floccular nodular lobe, and you can see then that in the normal anatomical arrangement it's folded up underneath the posterior lobe, and so you can only see little bits of it sticking out at the side. I'm going to spend just a few slides talking about the consequences of and the recognition of damage to the cerebellum, because understanding what happens when the cerebellum is damaged is a good way of understanding what the cerebellum does in normal everyday biology. The things that damage the cerebellum are some of the usual suspects: a tumor or a stroke or some sort of trauma, a blow to the back of the head. Unfortunately, the location of the cerebellum back here does make it quite susceptible to blows to the head, and things like road traffic accidents or military accidents or conflict can result in damage to the cerebellum. In fact, lots of the biology of the cerebellum was first elucidated using people who had unfortunately been the victims of military trauma. Cerebellum is also the cerebellum is also fairly susceptible compared to other brain regions to the effects of alcohol. If you think about what happens when someone's drunk too much alcohol, one of the first signs of that is that they become unsteady on their feet. That's a sign of cerebellar impairment. People who drink a lot of alcohol for a long time, usually chronic long-term alcoholics, will eventually cause permanent irreversible damage to their cerebellum, and they'll present then as a cerebellar ataxic gait, and I'll talk in a bit more about what that is in a second. There are also various cerebellar ataxias, damage to the cerebellum, that are genetic. They are inherited or they have a significant genetic component. This again is something that's quite unusual compared to other brain regions. The cerebellum appears to be more susceptible to these than other parts of the brain. Okay, so when the cerebellum goes wrong, here are three sorts of things that we might see. One is a common presentation of people who are seeking some sort of medical help, and the next two are things that we might look for when trying to see if somebody's cerebellum is working as we would hope for. The major thing that the cerebellum is associated with, or cerebellar damage is associated with, is ataxia. In particular, people with cerebellar ataxia, or an ataxia that's caused by damage to the cerebellum, will present with a wide gait. And the reason for that is because when they try and use a normal gait, i.e. they put their feet together, then they become very unsteady. And in order to try and account for that, or to mitigate against that, they spread their feet so they have a wide gait, and that's when they're standing and when they're walking as well. They will also have an instability of their trunk, of their upper body. Now, I'm not going to attempt to demonstrate that. There are plenty of videos out there showing what cerebellar ataxia looks like. The key thing is that it's the wide gait, and there's lots of instability that can start to look a little bit like tremor. What it actually is people unable to maintain balance and posture, and so constantly making small errors and then correcting for them. This presents then as this instability. Some simple ways that this is tested for: the first is to look for something called dysmetria. Dysmetria is an inability to coordinate complex motor activity involving several muscle groups. The way that we might test for dysmetria is something that you might have already seen when you've been learning your clinical skills or upper body neurological examinations. Patients are asked to do things like touch their nose and then touch the outstretched finger of the examiner or the person doing the exam, or to reach out wide and then reach in and touch their nose. They may also be asked to do this with their eyes closed. What happens in people with dysmetria is that they find this difficult. They often find it more difficult to accurately touch the outstretched finger of the person doing the exam. It will take them longer to get there, and as they do so, you may see what appears to be an intention tremor. It's again this cerebellum not being able to fine-tune and coordinate this otherwise smooth movement. We also see overreaching in people with cerebellar damage. This is often described in concert with dysmetria, and some people actually consider them to be the same thing. Overreaching would be the person attempts to touch their nose but misses, and overreaches or underreaches and can't quite locate that fine space, that fine point in space. The reason for this then is because the cerebellum, as I've said multiple times now, is important for the coordination of fine, smooth movements. I can't underestimate just how complicated it is for me to be able to do this. Right? To be able to accurately put the tip of my finger on a very precise point in space, even without actually looking at it, is a really hard thing to do. That's why the cerebellum has so many neurons, and it's such a significant part of our overall nervous system. The second test that you might commonly see or read about as a test for cerebellar damage is a test for what's called dysdiadochokinesia. This is an inability to perform coordinated, smooth, rapid, alternating movements of the hands. If I show you what dysdiadochokinesia looks like, or if I show you what a test for dysdiadochokinesia looks like, it's normally something like this. You ask someone to put their hand out, one hand out in front of them, and take their other hand and rapidly alternate backwards and forwards, touching one side of the hand and then the other on top of the other one. Or to rapidly alternate the position of their hands in space, and do that with both hands doing it at the same time and ending up in the same place, so flat and flat. Again, the ability to do this is an amazing thing that we're able to do, but it requires an intact cerebellum to perform that fine, coordinated, smooth motor movement. People who can't do that quickly or can't do it accurately may be suffering from dysdiadochokinesia, and that may be because of cerebellar damage. Damage to the cerebellum then. A summary of what I've told you in the previous slides is often results in an impaired ability to perform smooth directed movements. Speech is a smooth directed movement. It's incredibly complicated, requires many fine muscle movements, and speech may be impaired in people with cerebellar damage. As I've said before, damage is normally expressed ipsilaterally, and the cerebellum is arranged somatotropically, and that can affect the expression of damage to the cerebellum. For example, the flocculus and vermis, if that's damaged, may affect eye movements. The medial parts of the hemispheres are more important for controlling the movements of the trunk. The lateral parts are more important for controlling the movement of limbs. All right, how is the cerebellum then connected to the brainstem? It's connected to the brainstem through pairs of peduncles. There are 3 of these. It's difficult to see them There are 3 of these. It's difficult to see them on many different anatomical models, but they're very basically these structures here that appear to link connect the cerebellum then onto the parts of the brainstem. There's obviously here some ventricular structures between the two, but in a 3-dimensional model it's slightly easy to see, but it's still quite tricky. Key things that we need to know about the function and the way the information flows around these peduncles is that there's 3 of them: inferior, middle, and superior. The superior is normally associated with the flow of information out of the cerebellum, although we'll talk about an exception to that in a couple of slides' time. Then you've got the middle and the inferior, which are associated with bringing information into the cerebellum. The middle cerebellar peduncle brings in information from the pons, the inferior from the inferior olivary nucleus, which is in the medulla, and then other regions as shown here. The basic arrangement of the cerebellum is as a little brain. It has a cortex, as you can see here, surrounding white matter, with then some deep cerebellar nuclei in the white matter. The dentate nucleus is just one of those. The way that the cerebellum is arranged gives us a clue as to its function. Here is the basic arrangement of the cell biology of the cerebellum. Now, we're not going to go into this in any great detail, but I think it's important and useful to explain a little bit about how this works. So here we have structures that are in the cortex of the cerebellum. Here we have structures that are in the white matter. You have the cerebellar inputs come into the cortex, processed, as I'll show you in a second. They go on to the deep cerebellar nuclei and then out. If we expand upon this in a bit more detail, we can see the basic arrangement of the major cell types in the cerebellum. One of the key things about the cerebellum, the cerebellar cortex in particular, is that it is arranged like the cerebral cortex into repeated functional units. And those functional units contain some a very simple but nevertheless functionally very complicated arrangement of a small number of cells. We've got mossy fibers coming in from pretty much everywhere in the body. They synapse onto granule cells. Those granule cells then give rise to what's called parallel fibers, fibers that run in parallel to the outer surface of the cortex. There are gazillions of granule cells. This is one of the major cell types of the cerebellum. They're very small, and this is one of the reasons why the cerebellum has so many neurons in it. Then we also have these climbing fibers that come from the inferior olivary nucleus in the medulla. And both these types, parallel fibers and climbing fibers, form connections with Purkinje cells. The Purkinje cell is the only output cell type of the cerebellum. It synapses onto these deep nuclei in the white matter, and these then convey the output from the cerebellum back into the motor system, as I showed you on that schematic earlier on. I'll give you a very simple explanation of how the cerebellum achieves the functions that I talked about at the beginning. Very basically, what's coming in here from these mossy fibers onto these granule cells that form the parallel fibers is information about the current state of the body. How stretched is a muscle, whereabouts is it in space, and so on. What comes in through the climbing fibers is information about errors. Both of these are then processed by the Purkinje cells. Purkinje cells are climbing fibers wrap around the Purkinje cells and affect the synapse between the parallel fibers and the Purkinje cells. So if the current state of the body is not what it is supposed to be, then the information about that error will come in from the climbing fibers and affect the strength of the interaction between the parallel fibers and the Purkinje cells, and thus change the output from the Purkinje cells. If these two things are the same, then the parallel fibers have their say and everything comes back out unaffected, i.e. the thing that happened was what was supposed to happen. Where there is an error or a need to correct, then that comes from the climbing fibers. It's a very simple, very basic explanation of what the cerebellum does, but it will do as a way of helping us understand what happens when it goes wrong and some of the as yet incompletely explained functions of the cerebellum. I'm going to show you now some of the white matter tracks by which the cerebellum is then connected on to the cortex, in particular the motor cortex, but other cortical regions as well. Here we have some diffuse and tensor imaging images from studies of a recreation of the white matter tracks of the human brain, in particular this one, the cortico-pontocerebellar white matter tracks. Here we have the cerebellum into the pons and then up into the cortex, in particular the motor cortex, but elsewhere as well. And you can see the arrangement of these with the cerebellum at the back here, the posterior. The eyes would be more or less about here, and this is the view that we would see if we were looking at the whole person. We're now going to show you a video of this playing through, because I think it gives you a really clear view of the complexity and the density of the wiring of the cerebellum into the cortex, and therefore the huge amount of information that is traded between these two regions in a real-time basis. There you can see massive numbers of fibers traded between these two. Let me just play it through again. That's a principal means by which we're able to coordinate fine motor movements, is because of the extensive crosstalk between the neocortex, the cerebral cortex, and the cerebellar cortex through this corticopontocerebellar white matter tracts. The other important tracts that we need to just briefly mention before we finish are the tracts that bring the information into the cerebellum in the first place. The principal of these is the spinocerebellar tract, meaning it comes from the spine into the cerebellum. It's wired ipsilaterally, and it brings in information from muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. There are three basic subtracts of the spinocerebellar tract, and where they come in to the spine depends upon whereabouts in the body, which level the spine they come from. We don't need to go into the detail of that, but I do need to explain a little bit about the differences between these three subtracts. First of them is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. This is perhaps the easiest to understand. It comes in to the spinal cord. There's a synapse which then ascends ipsilaterally via the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum. Pretty straightforward. The second of these then is the cuneo-cerebellar tract. Again, it comes into the spinal cord, but then ascends through the spinal cord without synapsing. The second order neuron of this subregion of the spinocerebellar tract is then in the accessory cuneate nucleus, which is in the lower medulla, hence the name cuneo-cerebellar tract. This then synapses with neurons that go, the second order neuron that goes into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So far, it's all fairly straightforward. It's all ipsilateral, and that's the key thing I'm trying to explain in a bit more detail here. The reason we need to go into this is because of the third component, the ventral spinocerebellar tract. And here you can see I've put left and right onto the diagram. Again, it's fairly straightforward at the beginning. The sensory neurons come into the spinal cord. They then synapse and they decussate across the spinal cord. They then ascend and then they decussate again. They go into the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. This is the exception I talked about earlier on, of information that comes into the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncle, which we normally think of as being a structure through which information leaves the cerebellum. The superior cerebellar peduncle decussates in the midbrain, specifically in the inferior colliculus. This is important then because if there is damage above the inferior colliculus to the superior cerebellar peduncle, then the damage might not be expressed ipsilaterally. It's quite uncommon, but it's important to be aware of it. The final thing that I want to talk about is some of the cognitive effects of cerebellar damage to tell us a little bit about a potential role for the cerebellum in normal cognitive function. We don't really truly understand this in any great detail, but I think it's important to mention. One of the reasons we perhaps don't understand this in great detail is that where people have cerebellar damage, in general, the motor effects are more obvious, they're more pronounced, and they may also be more impairing. People are more concerned with the obvious motor deficits that occur in cerebellar damage. But there are some obvious cognitive problems as well. They're also a bit more diffuse, a bit more complicated. It's not easy to pin them down in a simple summary, which is maybe also why we haven't paid as much attention to them until fairly recently. A simple summary of them as best I can is that they affect visuospatial and executive function. And you'll know from other sessions that executive function includes a lot of things like working memory, some of our linguistic ability. Some of the errors, some of the problems that arise from cerebellar damage are in things like flexibility and error correction. If you think back to what I told you right at the beginning, what the cerebellum does in motor function is, as simply as I can make it, correcting for errors and predicting future activities. It's reasonable to assume that some of the cognitive problems that arise from cerebellar damage come from a similar basic mechanism. Problems with flexibility in cognition could arise because of a difficulty in trying to identify, mismatches between what's supposed to happen and what actually happened in terms of cognition, as well as also in terms of motor function. That's a bit of a general working hypothesis at the moment, and as I said, we don't really have yet a great explanation for how this works or for what the role of the cerebellum is in cognition. There's certainly more to come. Okay, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about the cerebellum. Here are some references for some of the images. There's a paper here by Zhang and co-workers from which we took the information about the white matter tracts. Any questions, send me an email. Here is my email address. Almost all the other images were taken either from textbooks or mostly from Wikipedia, and they're all used under a fair use exemption for teaching. I hope that was useful for you. Like I said, any questions, send me an email. I'll hopefully see you in another video. Goodbye.